Well, welcome everybody to the Paul Mellon Centre for Studies in British Art. My name's Sarah Turner, I'm the director here, and it gives me a very great pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's event, Book Night. I think it's safe to say it's one of our favourite events of the year, not just amongst the team, but for many of you who I know are regulars at this event, and really enjoy listening to our authors and hearing about not just the finished product of their book, but the experience of research and writing. Now, I am very biased, but I think this list of books, our autumn list, is absolutely brilliant. I'm so proud of it. I think it really shows the range of British art and architectural history at its very best, and we're seeing such a fabulous reaction to all of the books from readers and the press more widely. My job tonight is just to give you a very warm welcome. I look forward to chatting with many of you over a drink at our reception afterwards, but to chair tonight's event, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Kate Retford, who is our Head of Research, Resources and Publications. So, Kate, over to you.
Well, I'd like to start by extending, similarly, a very warm welcome to Book Night, a key event in everybody's calendar. Yes, I'm one of the newest recruits to the Paul Mellon Centre, so I started as Head of Research, Resources and Publications in July. That does mean that I can claim absolutely no credit for any of the books you'll be hearing about tonight, but I am still going to enjoy basking in the general triumph and glow. The credit at this end goes entirely to Sarah, our senior editor, Emily Lees, and the publications team. So, as Sarah said, this is a particularly illustrious list. So we've got for you tonight a series of major works by some of the foremost scholars in our field. And it's also a very varied list. So we're going to be moving from Tudor England through to the mid-20th century, and spanning paintings, drawings, architecture, and the very rich array of visual culture covered in British Blonde. Now, the format is that each of our authors is going to give you a very pithy 10-minute talk. I will start waving after 10 minutes. We'll have a general question and answer and discussion section at the end. It's a fun, if you've been to PMC Book Night before, you'll be familiar with this format. It's a very fun, zippy format, but we don't think it takes away from what is the very serious business and achievement of having written books quite as monumental as these. And I think it's a good moment at the very start to acknowledge what we know are years of work, from conceptualisation to research, through writing, to all of the copy editing, proofing, layouts. It's a huge amount of work being shared with you tonight. Now, as we're moving at speed, I'm going to keep introductions to each speaker in turn brief. But fortunately, the cliche of generally needs no introduction will largely hold true, because these are particularly famous scholars in our field. So we're going to start tonight with Richard Ormond, former Deputy Director of the National Portrait Gallery, Director of the National Maritime Museum, who's also done great service through trustee work, as well as being the author we're celebrating here tonight. Now, we're coming to the end of the 100th anniversary year of Sargent's death, and it was marked at the PMC by two major publication projects. One was the adding of all 9 volumes of Richard and Elaine Kilmurray's Sargent catalogue Raisonné to the Yale e-portal, which now makes them available online, and many of them had already sold out and gone out of print. And the other was the publication of the new book, which Richard is going to be speaking about tonight. John Singer Sargent, The Charcoal Portraits, a detailed study of these much less well-known works by the artist. Shall I hand through? Open this for you. Have you got it? It's your PowerPoint?
No, I've got the images. Good evening. As Kathleen has said, this is a follow-up, my catalogue of the Charcot portraits. It's been quite a slog, because there are 694 Charcot portraits, they all had to be traced, researched, written up and photographed. By the way, quite a few of them I haven't managed to trace. I came to a point when I realized either I was never going to publish it because I could never trace them all. But anyway, so I decided to publish. So if anybody knows of any Charcot's portraits, please let me know. They're relatively little known because most of them are still in the hands of the descendants of the sitters. And very interestingly, at Kenwood with the heiresses, everybody there was saying, how wonderful, we didn't realize about these drawings. There are a few in museums, some have been sold at auction, but they're very little known. And of course, as Sargent, like the oil portraits, they're very vibrant and characterful. He chose how to pose them and added accessories to sort of enliven them. But they really are rather wonderful in their own right. They cost, just to go into the details, they cost anywhere between £50 and £100. The Sargent gave up painting portraits in oil in 1907 because he wanted to do his murals, and he wanted to do landscapes and subject pictures, things he wanted to do. Rather to the shock and horror of society, but Mr. Sargent, you've always painted us. What do you mean? I won't paint you, but I will draw you. And he could do those in 2.5 hours. So they were, but even so, the number began to slow him down. He became rather fed up with the Charcot mugs, he called them, his portrait mugs. So I started with some advantages because a previous scholar, David McKibbin from Boston, had spent in the 1940s and 50s tracking Sargent. He was supposed to be doing a catalogue raisonné, but the truth was he loved researching, but he didn't like writing. And so he never got very far with the cataloguing, but he left me all his papers. So that was a good start, including wonderful letters from sitters saying what it was like sitting to Mr. Sargent. Mr. Sargent, used to roar down towards the easel, put the easel and put the portrait and the person side by side, and then he'd roar down, huffing and puffing, rather intimidating, and he'd break off to play the piano to break the tension. Anyway, yes. The earliest Charcots go back to the 1880s, but he really gets going in 1907 when he stops painting oil portraits. There are about a third are American and about 2/3 are British sitters. The same proportion is 2/3 female, 1/3 male. So that's just to give you an idea of the gender of his sitters. And he took about 2.5 hours to draw a Charcot. And if it wasn't going right, in the same way with his paintbrush, he makes the surface, and it's so instantaneous. So with the Charcots, and he has the same mastery of his medium. The Charcot stump of different thicknesses is applied in the same sort of bravura style. I had some very many fascinating tours of private collections, in Britain and America in company with my photographer, Chris Calnan. I remember a friend saying, "Oh, Richard, forget your boring old catalogue. Why don't you just write up your experiences of meeting people?" I always remember a very eminent lady who was married to the president of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and we happened to be in her vicinity. She'd never answered any letters, she'd never answered the telephone or anything. And my photographer said, "Richard, why don't we just ring the doorbell?" And I said, "Well, I don't think we can really do that." He said, "Come on, we've nothing to lose." So we rang the doorbell, and somebody from a Romanian housekeeper came, and we explained why we wanted to see the lady in question, and she said, "I like your voices. I think I'll let you in," which of course she shouldn't have done. And we found her doing the crossword. She was about 93, doing the crossword in the kitchen. And she said, "Oh, yes, how nice to see you. Of course, come in, have a cup of coffee." And then I'd forgotten that she actually owned a Sargent watercolour as well as and then it was rather nice because her son turned up with his daughter, and my photographer posed them, Gay, as she was called, Gay, holding the drawing of her father, and then the son and the 4 generations. So that was, but there were all sorts of adventures. But anyway, I haven't got time for that. How am I doing on time? Yes, and I must pay tribute to Emily Lees, because it was she who said, "I want your book to be, your volume to be scholarly, but I want it to be a beautiful book." And I really think she succeeded, because, of course, some of the images are very small, but she included 100 whole-page drawings, which really gives an uplift to the catalogue. I'm sure I've gone on for quite long enough, but anyway, that's and I hope there'll be an exhibition here in London. The National Portrait Gallery turned down. There was a rather good exhibition of them, which I curated in the Morgan Library, and that was the first time, and everybody, it was real breakthrough. But the National Portrait Gallery, "Oh no, we did an Sargent exhibition too soon, you can't." So if anybody has any ideas, I think it'd be wonderful to show these Charcots. It's a fascinating cast of characters. If you've got all the oils, which is one lot of famous, eminent people, but then on the others, the Charcots, a whole other portrait gallery. Winston Churchill and Nancy Astor and then other people whom you don't know about, but actually turn out to have fascinating lives. Anyway, enough from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was actually beautifully timed and a fine example. Yes, I think I'd underscore how beautiful this book is. I think the reproductions of the charcoal drawings are really stunning. So our next speaker tonight is Elizabeth Goldring. Elizabeth is Honorary Professor, recent promotion, congratulations, Honorary Professor at the University of Warwick, a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries and a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society. And she's based in Warwick Centre for the Study of the Renaissance, which I mention because I think it underscores the thoroughly interdisciplinary nature of her work that moves very fluidly between art, literature and history. She's also another established PMC author with her previous monographs on Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, and the world of Elizabethan art, which was published in 2014, and Nicholas Hilliard, Life of an Artist from 2019, which won the Apollo Book of the Year award. And Holbein Renaissance Master is already proving even more of a triumph, securing particularly extensive press coverage. There's a Guardian review which seems to be going borderline viral. So, without further ado, I hand over to Elizabeth.
Does this come down? Great. Well, as is so often the case with these things, my new book, Holbein Renaissance Master, has grown out of my last book, Nicholas Hilliard, Life of an Artist. Hilliard, who was, of course, court painter to Elizabeth I, idolized Hans Holbein, who, of course, had been court painter to Elizabeth's father, Henry VIII. For Hilliard, Holbein was quite simply the greatest master that ever was. But when, in the course of writing my book about Hilliard, I went in search of basic facts and dates about Holbein with a view towards better understanding his influence on Hilliard, I was surprised to discover that the most recent scholarly biography, A.B. Chamberlain's, was more than 100 years old. And I suppose the seed of an idea was planted at that point, a seed which took root when I realized that 2026 would mark the 500th anniversary of the German-born Holbein's arrival in England, a milestone which seemed as good a time as any for a fresh look at his life, art, and multifaceted legacy, the goal being to create a scholarly biography for the 21st century. Often, in the past several years while I've been working on this book, people have said to me, how can there possibly be anything new to say about Holbein, which, of course, is a perfectly fair question. But I was absolutely thrilled and more than a little relieved to discover that even when dealing with the most familiar, most iconic, most written about of Holbein's works, there was always something new to discover, which is the mark, I think, of a great artist, and also perhaps the mark of a great artist who lived in and was an eyewitness to extraordinary historical events. So with that in mind, I want to spend a few minutes looking at Christina of Denmark, an image which, as many of you will know, is a product of Henry VIII's search for a fourth queen following the death of Jane Seymour. To take Christina's likeness, Holbein traveled from London to Brussels, where Christina was based in the spring of 1538. In trying to understand this commission and the painting that resulted from it, I think it's very important to remember that portraying Christina and other prospective brides for Henry was a singular and devilishly difficult task. Unlike most oil portraits, which of course were intended to be seen by a large audience, Holbein's paintings of would-be queens were highly focused exercises aimed at an audience of one, Henry VIII. And what Henry wanted was to see these ladies' physiognomies, their faces and their figures, rendered with science, that is to say, with accuracy. Such considerations, I suspect, help to explain why Holbein's painting of Christina is unique among his surviving portraits of women in being both life-sized and full-length. For Christina, as I discovered whilst poring over diplomatic correspondence, was unusually tall for a woman. Indeed, she was taller than many men, including two of Henry's ambassadors on the continent, who noted with surprise and some discomfort upon being presented to her that she was, quote, of stature higher than either of us. Presumably, the reason Holbein portrayed Christina life-sized and full-length is that he felt it absolutely crucial to convey visually to Henry just how tall she was. Don't forget that Henry, after Jane Seymour died, had announced that being a big person himself, he wanted wife number 4 to be big too. Indeed, Christina's much remarked upon height is emphasized by nearly every aspect of this painting, from its comparatively narrow width to the vertical shadow which runs the length of the portrait's right edge. Christina, of course, did not become Henry's fourth queen. She is said to have quipped, "If I had 2 heads, I would gladly put one at the disposal of the King of England." But despite the failure of this match, Henry must have liked Holbein's painting, for it remained in his possession, hanging on the wall of the Palace of Westminster long after any realistic prospect of a marriage to Christina had passed. So I'd now like to turn to the subject of the multiple afterlives Holbein and his life have been accorded over the past 500 years, something I had great fun exploring in the final chapter of my book. And there is perhaps no painting that better encapsulates the infinite variety of Holbein's legacy than Christina of Denmark. By the mid-16th century, Christina had passed from the royal collection into that of the Earls of Pembroke, who displayed the painting at Baynard's Castle, their London residence near where Blackfriars Station stands today. The Roman mannerist Federico Zuccaro admired Christina at Baynard's Castle while visiting England in 1575, proclaiming Holbein's works better than Raphael's. Indeed, Zuccaro seems to have taken inspiration from Holbein's painting for the life-size portrait of Elizabeth I that he was then working on, which we know about from his preliminary drawing. The painting itself does not survive. But as you can see from the drawing, the conical composition of Zuccaro's Elizabeth recalls Holbein's Christina, as does the full-length pose, hands clasped demurely at waist level. By about 1590, Christina had entered the collection of John Lord Lumley, one of the greatest collectors at the late Elizabethan court. In an apparent nod to Holbein's practice of sometimes including a cartellino as a frame for an inscription, as you can see here on this 1527 portrait of William Warham by Holbein, Lumley arranged to have cartellini added to many of the paintings in his collection as a collector's mark. And you can see in these rather grainy old black and white photos what Christina looked like when her Lumley cartellino was still visible. The style and shape of most Lumley cartellini differ from Holbein's own, but the debt is unmistakable. For Lumley, acquiring and displaying works by Holbein was integral to his sense of what it meant to be a collector. The same may be said of Thomas Howard, 2nd Earl of Arundel, the greatest art collector at the Stuart court, who in the early 17th century acquired Christina alongside more than 40 other paintings by Holbein. Like Lumley, Arundel viewed the acquisition of works by Holbein as integral to his sense of self, a sentiment vividly conveyed by this painting in which the Earl is depicted at his London mansion, Arundel House, with 2 paintings by Holbein visible in the background. Arundel House was, in the 17th century, a pilgrimage site for foreign artists visiting England, many of whom, like Van Dyck, took the opportunity to make sketches of the Holbeins on display. And here you have Van Dyck's now lost sketch of Christina. We're now, in the time that remains, going to fast forward to 1909, at which point Holbein's Christina had been on display at the National Gallery for nearly 30 years. Most visitors assume that the gallery owned the painting, but in fact, Christina was on loan from the Duke of Norfolk, who, in the spring of 1909, unexpectedly sold the painting to a London art dealer, who in turn offered the picture to Henry Clay Frick for £72,000, the understanding being that the gallery would have exactly 1 month to come up with an equivalent sum. A public appeal was immediately launched, contributors to which included Edward VII, George Bernard Shaw, and John Singer Sargent. For the duration of this fundraising effort, Christina was rarely out of the news, her plight a spur for cartoons like this one, in which a dastardly Uncle Sam tries to wrench her from her frame. Thanks to an anonymous 11th hour donation of £40,000, the picture was saved for the National Gallery, at which point cartoons like this one, depicting Christina embracing John Bull, began to appear. By all accounts, Henry Clay Frick was devastated by his failure to acquire Christina. Though he was, in 1909, already in possession of works by Titian, Rembrandt, and Vermeer, among others, Frick felt that he would never be viewed as a collector of the first rank until he had acquired a Holbein, which, of course, he went on to do a few years later. Henry James followed the tussle over Christina with great interest, making these events the basis for his last novel, The Outcry, a comedy of manners in which a wealthy American art collector attempts to buy a prized old master painting from an English lord who is asset-rich but cash-poor. To conclude, it is inevitable, perhaps, that Holbein will always be associated, at least in this country, first and foremost with Henry VIII and his court. Holbein definitively shaped perceptions of the king and those who orbited him, both for contemporaries and for posterity. But as I discovered when writing Holbein Renaissance Master, there is much, much more to Holbein's legacy. Few artists have had their works so consistently sought after by collectors of the first rank, and even fewer have had their works reinterpreted by so many later artists. The roll call of those who have copied or otherwise been inspired by Holbein's works includes not just Zuccaro and Van Dyck, whose responses we've looked at briefly, but also Hilliard, Rubens, Reynolds, Degas, Pissarro, Whistler, Jasper Johns. I could go on and on and on. In addition, Holbein's works have been a source of inspiration to numerous writers, not just Henry James, but also Dostoevsky, Edith Wharton, and of course, most recently, Hilary Mantel. The power of Holbein's art to attract collectors, viewers, imitators, and commentators has endured for more than half a millennium, and I'm delighted to say that there is no end in sight. Thank you.
Now, our next speaker is actually going to be coming to us via a recording, but Christine Casey is also present with us live, so she'll be able to join in the question and answer and discussion session at the end. Let me see if I've learnt. Oh, okay, you're going to do it. Okay. So our next speaker is Christine Casey, Professor of Architectural History and Fellow at Trinity College, Dublin, and she's also a member of the Royal Irish Academy and an honorary member of the Royal Institute of the Architects of Ireland. Now, Christine has become well known for her groundbreaking work on the relationship between architecture and decoration, and particularly importantly, I think, for reintroducing us to the craftspeople who are so often concealed behind architects. So her new book with the PMC, Architecture and Artifice, The Crafted Surface in 18th-Century Building Practice, is a study of facades and finishes, and it really effectively builds on previous scholarship, such as her aptly named 2017 monograph, Making Magnificence, Architects, Stuccatory and the 18th Century Interior. So I think now Femi is going to press play, and you'll get to hear Christine talking. And while I don't have to time, get to hear Christine talking about architecture and artifice.
Hello everyone, and greetings from Trinity College, Dublin. Behind me is the 18th century long room, or old library of the college, which is one of the many interiors included in my new Mellon book, Architecture and Artifice. This is a work which has been 6 years in the making and even longer in conception. Many years ago, having finished a hefty volume on Dublin City and casting around for a new project, I sought advice from peers as to what might come next. Craftsmanship, urged John Harris. What kind, I asked. All of it, he replied with characteristic gusto. The wealth of plasterwork in 18th century Dublin led to a study of stucco in architecture and ultimately to this book, which embraces that formidable challenge, all of it. For this was the proposal put to the Irish Research Council in 2019, resulting in a 4-year research project entitled Craft Value. By combining evidence from conservation and archival documentation, its aim was to retell the story of 18th century architecture in England and Ireland from the perspective of craft, a bottom-up approach focusing on the crafted surface more than the structure of buildings, and including both the envelope and the interior of the building, and the crafts of masonry, carving, joinery, and plasterwork. This involved exploring continuity in building culture across the archipelago of Britain and Ireland, to determine the standards which guided craft practice in the period. So looking at buildings from Rusperrin, County Wicklow, to Holcombe Hall in Norfolk. Unsurprisingly, the research charted the related craft circles of second cousins Sir John Vanbrugh in England and Sir Edward Lovett Pearce in Ireland, both of whom were indebted to standards and methods developed by Sir Christopher Wren and the Office of Works in the late 17th century. Thus, great buildings such as Blenheim loom large as protagonists because of their provenance and quality, but also because of the richness of their archives, which throw light on the ways in which more everyday buildings were created. Buildings of lesser scale also appear, such as Cusworth Hall in South Yorkshire, where rich archival material is available. And while Vanbrugh, Hawksmoor, Pearce and his assistant Richard Castle are also protagonists in the book, they stand off stage so that the spotlight falls on those who realise their buildings, the masons, carvers, joiners and plasterers who translated architectural drawings such as this one into three-dimensional form. The heroes of this book are men like the master mason Christopher Cass, who worked with Vanbrugh at Blenheim and also with James Gibbs at the Senate House in Cambridge. Likewise, carvers and masons such as Joseph Pickford and William Atkinson, who led a team of masons to create the Marble Hall at Holcombe, and indeed the innumerable anonymous craftsmen who constituted the workshops of named practitioners. One of my favourite images in the book is this monument to an anonymous craftsman, P.L., in a churchyard at Chapel Enleyfrith in Derbyshire. No surprise, therefore, that the book's jacket features not the great space of the saloon at Blenheim, nor its painted murals. Light falls instead on the stupendous marble doorcase by anonymous craftsmen of Grinlin Gibbon's largely unknown stone carving workshop. Indeed, one of the surprises of the book for me is the way in which it shifts emphasis to the materials from which architecture is created. The door frame of the jacket is a case in point, composed of 4 different types of marble, carefully selected and calculated to emphasize its individual elements, as you see here. The pilasters of the archway are of breccia with angular broken fragments, creating a bold frame to the more subtle veined marble of the inner jambs and lintel, which in turn highlights the fine statuary marble used in the foliated frieze and the scallop shell keystone of the arch. It was this focus on materials, which is really quite prevalent in this book, that led to my current research on stonework in 18th century architecture. But while stone and marble are emphasised in the book, craft practice in wood and in plaster are also analysed, informed by the evidence of past and present conservation work, and demonstrated often through the use of digital imagery, which has been developed by Andrew Tierney of the Craft Value team. Clandon Park in Surrey has been hugely instructive in understanding technique. And here you see the brick structure with the metal iron holdfasts which held on the timber lathing or base for the plasterwork of the Marble Hall. Privileged access to roof spaces and conservation scaffolding has revealed the structures that support virtuoso plaster ceilings. And here you see the back of the Great Cove in the Marble Hall at Holcombe, and a similar structure supports the coved ceiling of the saloon in the Provost House at Trinity College, Dublin. And ascending scaffolding during the COVID lockdown demonstrated the remarkable skill of 18th century carvers and of modern conservation practitioners. So the book seeks to uncover what has been described as a wisdom of hands, which is fundamental to the achievement of 18th century architecture. And here you see the frieze of the Dublin Custom House by the workshop of Edward Smith, Benjamin Schrouder, which was extensively conserved in the early 20th century. So at every opportunity, evidence is marshalled to demonstrate how this work was achieved, such as here at Nostell Priory in Yorkshire, where boasted or projecting masonry in the pediment was made ready for the carvers, but was not actually worked as originally planned. In conclusion, I would like to thank those who made this book possible: the Irish Research Council for its financial support, the Craft Value team for their research and editorial assistance, the European Research Council for enabling me to pursue the questions raised by this study, and last but by no means least, Emily Leese and the Paul Mellon Centre for Studies in British Art, who have produced what I hope you will agree is a beautifully designed and presented book. I hope that it will encourage further joined up research on craft activity in the architecture of these islands. Thank you. Hello everyone, and greetings.
Thank you very much to Christine. I love that phrase, the wisdom of hands. I think that really summarises some of the key meaning of this book, this new book that she's published. So last but certainly by no means least, our final speaker tonight is Lynda Nead, visiting Professor of History of Art at the Courtauld and formerly Pevsner Professor of History of Art and a colleague of mine at Birkbeck, University of London. Lynn's held numerous awards and fellowships. She's currently Fellow and Trustee of the British Academy and a Trustee of both the Holbein Museum and of the Campaign for the Arts. She has published extensively on 19th and 20th century visual culture. I'm not going to start listing the numerous articles and books. The fact that The Female Nude was reissued last year as a Routledge classic, I think, says it all. So tonight she's going to be talking about her new exploration of post-war British culture, following on from The Tiger in the Smoke, Art and Culture in Post-War Britain, which was published by the PMC in 2018. British Blonde is based on Lynn's Mellon lectures, which brightened our winter 2 years ago at the V&A, and it's also already garnering extensive press coverage. My favourite quote so far was from the Apollo, which referred to her prose as white hot as a platinum wig under a spotlight. That was a great quote. Lynda.
Thank you very much. I think I remember the image that got me started on British Blonde. It was this photograph of the British actress, singer and celebrity Diana Dawes on the cover of Picture Post, hands on hips, staring directly out of the image at the reader, defiant and provocative. To the right, a headline about the Suez Crisis. And this is what intrigued me. What's the relationship between this woman and Suez, between her body and Britain in the 1950s? I was also, and I remain, drawn to the artifice of Dawes's look. Blonde, almost daffodil yellow hair, red lipstick, gold charm bracelet and cuff, and those distinctive bullet-shaped breasts. The remarkable blonde bombshell body of the 1950s, curvaceous and opulent, almost baroque. This is Dawes at the peak of her career in her persona as the British Marilyn, whose body seems the perfect corporeal expression of the emerging affluence and last-ditch military defiance of Britain in this period. It's also the visual culmination of the migration of American Hollywood-style glamour to Britain. Glamour and sexualized femininity were part of a larger passage of commodities across the Atlantic in this period. But in the process, something important happened. Blonde became British, and Marilyn Monroe became Diana Dawes, the pin-up girl of the Suez Crisis. What did blonde mean to women in wartime and post-war Britain? Above all, it meant Hollywood glamour and the power and sexuality of stars such as Jean Harlow, Mae West, Veronica Lake, and Marilyn Monroe. British women in the 1940s and 1950s went to the cinema frequently, sometimes several times a week. My mother did. The images they saw in films fed their fantasies and desires. They were a form of escape and a source of aspiration. Blonde was a cipher, a symbol of glamorous, desirable femininity, but it had a dark side. It was also the trademark of the femme fatale and of a dangerous and threatening sexual power that could provoke vengeful retribution. As well as in the cinema, blondness was sold to British women through the medium of advertising. The 1950s and 1960s saw the rise of a consumer society in Britain, as years of austerity and rationing in the 1940s were gradually replaced from the mid-1950s by greater affluence and spending. American advertising also travelled eastwards during these years, with American companies opening in Britain and British companies adopting and reworking American marketing techniques. As consumption levels in Britain grew throughout the 1950s, women were identified as key purchasers of new household products, including family goods, toiletries, and cosmetics. Advertisements for blonde hair dye proliferated in these years. Don't be a mouse, an advert for Golden Shading urged its readers. Follow the stars and be a glamorous blonde. As well as selling the fantasy of a life lived blonde, advertising also played on women's fears of not looking glamorous or of dyed hair reverting to an indifferent, mousy brown. Drawing on psychological studies and focus groups, advertisers played on women's dissatisfaction with their looks and the gap between their self-image and the image of the female star. Mousy, dull, or darkening hair was the antithesis of gleaming golden blonde locks, and women were encouraged to appraise their appearance constantly and judge if they measured up to the advertisements or the marketing campaigns. Mirror, mirror on the wall, make me fairest of them all, advised a Hilton advertisement. Failure was a continual threat, and post-war advertising campaigns drew on an image of blonde perfection to keep women in a state of self-doubt and insecurity. As the chairman of one large retail group declared, quote, "Our job is to make women unhappy with what they have." Post-war Britain was a world in which want and desire were a political and psychological reality for women, in which material goods were believed to access a world of privilege, and a lack of those goods created a cycle of failure, envy, and frustration. The growth of the consumer market, the expansion of goods, and the rhetoric of advertising created for women what historian Carolyn Steedman has described as a culture of longing, a feeling of want and discontent that drove on women to seek their elusive, perfect selves. Diana Dawes and the three other women who are the focus of my book, Ruth Ellis, the last woman to be hanged in Britain, actor Barbara Windsor, and pop artist Pauline Boty, are the prompts for a broader historical discussion of critical themes within the social, cultural, and artistic histories of the period. In British Blonde, the figure of post-war blonde femininity is used as a lens to access a history of women, desire, and the image across the fault lines of class and race, and through the narratives of want and aspiration, sleaze and popular culture, the female body and patriarchy, and whiteness and its others. I remain amazed by these women's resilience and agency, and appalled by the casual violence and aggression to which they were subjected. It's a history with whose legacy we still live today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynn, for bringing our presentations to a very powerful conclusion. So I'm now going to invite our 4 speakers to take up the chairs that have been set up for you. And I think, is this where Christine will now appear on the screen, looking down on us all benignly? There we go. Christine, can we check? Can you hear us?
But now it's...
Okay. Oh.
Christine, you're muted.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
It's very nice to have you with us live. Yes, if you go up there. And just to remind everybody as we move into the question and answer and discussion part of the evening, if you can make sure that you're always talking to a microphone, which isn't just about amplifying you for the room, it's also for the recording and for Christine as well. So I'd like to, before I open up the floor, to take the opportunity to thank all 5 of our speakers for fantastic presentations, as well as for the extraordinary books that underpin them. I was struck by the comment about the brief that they'd been given about sort of origins, pitfalls and triumphs, and I think we've heard a lot about origins and triumphs, but I think the pitfalls have been hard to spot. I do find the sort of the stories of where books have come from endlessly fascinating. You know, that germ that gets the project going, whether it's a striking image of Diana Dawes, or whether it's a chance discovery while the kids are watching TV, or whether it's a project that grows out of the previous project as work evolves and research evolves. The other thing that really struck me as we were listening to the talks is the extraordinary range of research and legwork that has gone into these books. Research in an extraordinary array of libraries, archives, work looking at images, looking at paintings in store, in conservation, time spent up ladders. I mean, some of those images of Christine's are quite hair-raising, clearly swinging about on some scaffolding, looking at bits of Clarendon Park. So I think I shall leave it there because I don't want to eat too much into the discussion time. I will throw it open for anybody who would like to ask the first question. Emma.
Since nobody else is, I started to thank you for 5, I beg your pardon, wonderful presentations. It's just the question that came to mind was really prompted by Lynn's presentation. I was just wondering the origins of the idea of blonde as a femme fatale colour, given that it's associated with childhood, and I was trying to think who would be the original blonde femme fatale, and I thought of Rosamund Vincy in Middlemarch, who's always described as having infantine fair hair, and I wondered if the origins of the blonde femme fatale was something you thought about.
No. I mean, no, because, you know, how a lot of people have asked me about, you know, classical Greece and ancient Egypt and ways of dyeing hair, and I have not written a history of blonde. I've written a cultural history of post-war Britain through the specific lens of this particular kind of femininity that seemed to articulate so many aspects of class, race, gender, and sexuality that fascinate me in post-war Britain. So you know, that there are in fact some books that do that kind of origins study, and you know, I thank you. I know it was a generous question, but I'm not writing a history of blonde. I'm writing a history of post-war Britain.
Indeed.
Oh, sorry, you're up.
Thank you. Can I ask Sam Smiles, please? Is there any specific connection between the Zong and Turner's painting, or is it merely something that the two have become associated with one another and it's become received wisdom with no basis?
Yeah, I mean, it has become such a cliche, but it originates in an article written by the art historian T.S.R. Boas a long time ago. He was writing an article about romantic shipwrecks, and in one paragraph, just one, suggested that maybe Turner had heard about the Zong when he was a kid, or maybe had decided to look at a history of the slave trade in 1839. And so he, to his credit, Boas never said he thought Turner was illustrating it. He thought perhaps, you know, it mixed up with what he'd read in James Thompson's poem, The Seasons, which describes a slave ship foundering in a storm at sea, with this sort of folk knowledge he had of the Zong. But he certainly wasn't in that article trying to prove it. He just floated it as an idea, but it stuck because it was convenient and because it seems, and this isn't to deprecate my fellow toilers in the academic field over so many generations, that was the kind of go-to atrocity, if you like, that everybody knew about. It was the most thoroughly reported at the time, and it was repeated in many of the histories of slavery in subsequent years. But in actual fact, the more you look at it, the more it just doesn't stack up. Turner's title is not about throwing living captives overboard. The title is very specific, Dead and Dying. So he's dealing with a mortality or imminent mortality that's already taken place, whereas the Zong victims were all, they were unhealthy, but they were all very much still alive. Moreover, some have said, well, okay, if it's not a direct reference, maybe it's an allusion. Now, this is going to sound very nerdy. I apologize. You'll need to read the book for the full nerdiness. But when Turner makes allusions, he does them in an almost programmatic way, which give clues to an attentive spectator of how to follow it out. None of those are included in that painting. And I think we should take what we see. This is a South American ship. It's something that's happening in the South Atlantic. It's nowhere close to the Caribbean. And it is in response to the big legislative efforts that were being made in the late 1830s, particularly by Palmerston, trying to suppress the foreign slave trade. And that's its meaning. What it is really about is capitalizing on recent books, very recent, published in 1839, one of them, which was looking at the sheer waste of the triangular trade, how many captives died through malnutrition, illness, and general poor treatment. And a statistic was given that 25% of those who were forcibly embarked never disembarked at the other side of the Atlantic. So that the dead and dying are ciphers for this tragic loss of life through inhumane treatment, rather than a specific reference to an atrocity of the 1780s.
Thank you very much.
Sam, I just wondered, did Turner claim compensation or receive compensation after the Abolition Act?
Well, his estate foundered very quickly. I say his as though he owned it. He was only one subscriber among many. It really was an economic, or sort of financial rather, disaster for all the subscribers. It was being wound up within 3 years of starting. And it ended up in a Chancery Court case with those who wanted to try and redeem part of their stake being offered the chance to go and get some sort of recompense. I don't know how much they received. It was probably about 30% of their stake, but there is no evidence that Turner, none of the applicants to that fund are recorded. I mean, was he flinty-hearted enough by then to try and get part of his money back. He was a notorious skinflint, but I am feeling that by then all he would have felt was gladness that the episode was finally closed. I think it very unlikely that he would have gone to the Court of Chancery and asked for his 5 shillings or whatever he might have got back.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really came out for me from Sam's talk and also from Elizabeth's one is this point that basically things that we think we know very well. We think we know the slave ship very well, we think we know Holbein very well. And something Elizabeth said really resonated with me. There is always something new to discover. And I think that digging into these details about Turner has had rich fruit. Sarah Turner.
Thank you. My question came from thinking with Christine's presentation, and particularly about the role of photography for architectural history and detail. And Christine, I was wondering whether the photography, and I'm imagining you had to commission quite a lot of new photography for your book to get the very specific details about the material or the forms you were discussing, whether the images and the kind of process of thinking about a book as a physical object where you've got your argument next to the images, whether actually photography allowed you to come to a new argument or do a different kind of research than looking from the ground. And I'm particularly thinking about some of the masonry shots you showed us where, you know, they're a long, if you're stood on the ground looking up, they're a long way. But when you're looking at a detail photography, you're in a different kind of relationship with the object, which a book publication can really dramatise and stage. And I think, again, you can see that in some of the other books as well, when we're looking at details or, you know, really close-ups of material. We kind of can do a different kind of work. But I thought, especially with your book, Christine, that really comes through, and thinking about the relationship between text and image. So just be interested to hear a little bit more about that process of commissioning images and thinking through photography and reproduction in particular.
That's a very interesting comment, thank you. Yes, I mean, I think photography certainly allows us to look very closely, and in fact, working with geologists, I mean, they are looking so closely through a hand lens at this stone. You know, you're actually beginning to look at it in a sort of forensic way, and it does alter the way you think about things. So at the moment, I'm trying to look at geodiversity, for example, right across England and Ireland, and so we are looking at ways of actually trying to capture the texture. So it's going even beyond the kind of detailed photography that we did there for architecture and artifice. But it is a really important tool, and we're using, you know, thin sections and all sorts of things to try and get at the detail of the material. So it's a fundamental tool in a materials-based approach, as it is, of course, in painting or anything else. And we're doing our best to use it effectively.
I wanted to ask a question of Elizabeth about, there was a comment in your book about going to see works, particularly in sort of in store and in conservation. And I was wondering, I mean, there's so many sort of new archival findings in the book, and I was wondering what about the amount of time you've spent with Holbein's work in close quarters and seeing it being conserved has also fed into some of your new analysis.
Absolutely, yes. I was very lucky to be able to see an awful lot of Holbein's works in the flesh. We're obviously very lucky in this country to have huge Holbein holdings, particularly in the Royal Collection, and the curators at the Royal Collection were incredibly generous in allowing me to come to Windsor Castle day after day after day after day. And for security reasons, you know, someone always has to be present, sort of babysitting, and so they were awfully indulgent in inviting me into the Royal Library to look at the drawings and miniatures. and also letting me visit the state apartments where the oil paintings are at times when the apartments were closed to the public. And as many of you will know, the paintings are hung 18th century style, so right up to the ceiling, and I'm quite short, so they brought me a ladder and a torch, and this was just one of many examples of ways in which people really went out of their way to help me with my research. At the Met, they took me into storage and some very spooky tunnels in the basement of the Met. I thought, definitely someone should write a murder mystery set in those tunnels. Of course, much of the writing of this book, or well, not much, but some of it coincided with lockdown when, of course, travel wasn't an option. But I was very lucky in that so many museums now have such fantastic online resources and such high-res images that you can really zoom in on, that my research was able to continue up to a point, certainly during lockdown. I mean, I was jolly glad when lockdown finished, but it wasn't the complete disaster that it might have been from a research point of view. Yes, very exciting. And I spent a lot of time in the archives looking at inventories and other documents that shed light on what people were hanging on the walls, which really highlighted for me the way in which it is, after Holbein comes to England in the mid-1520s, and that the English really catch the portraiture bug. Portraiture isn't really a thing in England before the mid-1520s, and thanks to Holbein acting in concert with early patrons like Thomas More, suddenly everyone wants to commission a portrait, multiple versions, so they can send copies to family, friends, fellow courtiers, and before you know it, the English are obsessed with hanging portraits of the great and good in their long galleries, and you can really trace it very, very precisely in the documentary records, the inventories and so forth, that this is something that begins with Holbein and his key patrons at Henry's court. So that was very, very exciting.
Start the obsession with mugs. Any other questions from the floor?
I have a question about John Singer Sargent. I haven't had the chance yet to see the charcoals in specific. My idea of John Singer Sargent is these big portraits that he made of Harry James, Henrietta Franklin, and all of that. Him doing the charcoals, was he, because you mentioned that he also liked to do landscapes and things like more for himself. Was the charcoal idea pushed towards him more for some sort of specific commissions, or was it something that he felt like he needed to develop, maybe because he loved it so much, or was something different for him?
A good question. No, they were commissions, but if from nobody turned up at his studio out of the blue. There was always that, and when you get into it, they're all linked by family or friendship, so that you realize that you're exploring not just the individual image or the individual drawing, but a whole network. That is how it all comes about. And that's rather interesting, the links between people. And it's quite a small society, so people know each other much more than, it's not, society's not a great big thing, London society, and ditto with Boston. And of course there are the transatlantic links, which are quite important. A lot of the Americans were drawn in London rather than in New York or Boston.
Oh, hello. I had one for Christine about, I wondered, it's a bit outside your remit, but Berkeley, you're in the library that I think Berkeley might have had something to do with, George Berkeley on his return from the Grand Tour, but the library that you're, he's been denamed as is the brutalist one, I think, because of him being involved in slavery. Well, that's just a false link to what I'm saying. But in terms of materials, I wondered if you looked at his, I haven't seen the book, I'm afraid, but I wondered if you looked at his his intervention in Castletown, in the correspondence and the design of that. But in terms of the materials more, I've always been interested in, I finally got to visit Whitehall in Rhode Island, which was a sort of farmhouse that when he moved out there and he had his slaves, he slapped a door case on based on William Kent's designs of Inigo Jones, and it actually is rather underrated as the first piece of Palladianism in America. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I didn't know about that. Thank you. But certainly I do cite the correspondence between Percival and Berkeley with respect to Castletown House, which, for those of you who don't know, it's the largest and kind of earliest Palladian house in Ireland. And this correspondence is very interesting because it shows that there is a sort of patriotic approach to materials in Ireland in the early 18th century. Likewise, you have the same sort of approach to textiles, a sort of protectionism. So Berkeley and Percival, they're writing to each other and saying that Castletown should be the epitome of the kingdom, and that all the stones of Ireland should be used in this house. And that's quite interesting because in Dublin, for example, while you have Palladian architecture and neoclassical architecture, and it's very close to what you get in Britain, the materials are quite different, and the material that is used extensively is granite. And the English did not like granite as a material for monumental architecture. There is actually correspondence with regard to Blenheim saying, I've seen this stone in the West Country and it gathers up grit and it never looks well. And yet that is the stone which forms the hills south of Dublin. And it becomes a really dominant facing material in Dublin, and it's combined with Portland stone. So you have columns, porticos of Portland stone, and the rest is granite, which gives Dublin that quite distinctive appearance. And I think there is this patriotic aspect in the early 18th century, and also obviously it's cheaper and it's easy to get, and Portland stone is expensive.
Thank you. I think they used Portland stone in Castletown a bit later on, didn't they? I think.
There's limited amount of Portland stone. Portland tends to be used for flags, for paving, for chimney pieces, for door cases, or for columns in porticos. But that's really the height of it because of the cost of bringing it in. Now, one thing Kate said about us not speaking enough about the pitfalls, and we have heard mention of the pandemic and the closure of archives. And I would like to say that this happened to me because I started work on this book at the end of 2019, and by March 2020 everything was closed down. And one of the amazing initiatives particularly in the Bodleian Library, was a mediated scanning program where you could get archival material, extensive archival material, free. So I was able to get major chunks of correspondence for the Tucker family who ran the quarries at Portland, on the Isle of Portland. And all that material was scanned, and likewise in other archives throughout Britain. So that was, at one level, it was a disaster, but at another level, it provided this wealth of scanned material.
Yes, I think the digital landscape was completely transformed. And there was also a period of extraordinary collegiality of people scanning, taking pictures, sending things to each other. I'm going to squeeze in a question for Lynn, which I realise I've never actually asked, despite having had opportunities. which is a very rather prosaic one. Were there any women who didn't make the cut? I don't think I've ever asked about the settling on the 4 case studies.
No, actually, but if I was going to write another chapter, I always think it would have been Dusty Springfield, and it would have been music, because what I wanted to do was work across different forms of cultural production. So, you know, with an actor, looking at comedy, looking at the idea of blonde noir through Ruth Ellis, and then the visual arts and Pauline Boty. But I didn't do music, and she's so interesting. So if we do another edition, we could have a chapter on Dusty.
Actually, I'm going to throw that question open to the panel as a whole, because I'm now in the position of supporting Emily as we nag people to keep word counts down. Was there anything that didn't make the cut, sort of didn't kind of get into the final manuscript in other books that had to be, that went in the cutting floor? No?
I think you'll have to ask the readers.
Actually, Kate, speaking of cutting floor, I jettisoned a section on floors.
Oh,
from
quite literally the cutting floor.
Be a good article.
Yeah. Okay, I think unless there's anybody wants to have a final word, I'm going to bring this to a close and move us on to the popping of corks and the opening of snacks. But I want to thank all 5 of our speakers tonight for really wonderful presentations, for wonderful books underpinning the presentations. I'd also like to thank, you've heard a lot about our publications team tonight. I'd like to thank Emily Lees and the publications team, who are all here tonight, book publications team, for the incredible work they've done on these books, and also to our events team for putting together this evening and ensuring it ran extremely smoothly, including with digital components, which always strike the fear into all of us. So a round of applause, and then we'll go for some drinks.